Okay, so that's threat of substitutes, and in order to discourage substitutes, we want buyers to have really high switching costs, so it's expensive for them to switch from one industry to another, just like I'd have to go out and buy a Tesla to switch from gasoline power to electric power. That's an expensive switching cost. The next thing we're going to talk about is new entrants. New entrants or new competitors will enter an industry when the return on investment exceeds the cost of entry barriers. And entry barriers are anything that prevents a new competitor from coming into the industry. So this can be things like the cost of technology. If you have to build, like, say, a factory, that's going to be really expensive. Economies of scale, where existing competitors are making so much of something that they can make it much cheaper than you. Brand awareness and customer loyalty. All of these things prevent new competitors from coming in. We're going to focus specifically on two entry barriers: government regulation and access to distribution channels. Government regulation is one of the most powerful, or can be one of the most powerful, influences on entry barriers. So for example, people complain about building new developments in San Francisco. San Francisco is in desperate need of housing, and yet to build new developments is this lengthy process where you have to go through all this government review, go through all these permits, pay all this money, and so it's very difficult. Those all represent entry barriers to come in and offer new housing in San Francisco. A liquor license in San Francisco costs $250K. So if you want to open up a bar and start competing with the existing bars in San Francisco, you're going to need 250 grand just to get the liquor license. If you want to be a degree offering institution, then you need to go through all these hoops and get accredited so that the government will recognize your degree and pay for and be willing to give you things like federal aid, which most universities, public and private, depend on. Some industries have very low entry barriers. So if I want to be an executive coach, I can just call myself an executive coach and then start charging people for it. I don't need to do any certification. I don't need to do anything. I can just be an executive coach. Which, by the way, if you know anyone that's looking for an executive coach, I'm a very good executive coach. What else we got? Oh, if I want to make an app, I can just do that in my bedroom on my computer. I don't need to ask anyone, get permission, get permits, sign regulations, anything like that. If you want to sell crafts on Etsy, you can go ahead and do that, and you don't need government approval. And so there are some industries where it's very difficult to get into the industry because of government regulation, and then there are some industries where it's very easy to get in. And in order to have a competitive industry, we want it to be easy for new people to come into the industry. An example of using government regulation to prevent new entrants into an industry is patent trolling. So we have government regulation about intellectual property and patents and who owns what and who can use it. And so existing competitors can sue new entrants for infringing upon their patents. And a lot of times it doesn't even matter if the person is actually infringing upon the patent or not, because it's really expensive to defend yourself against this. And so the idea isn't that, hey, this person's actually using our patent and taking advantage of our technology. It's that, well, either way, we can sue them for it. They're not going to be able to defend themselves, and then we'll win. An example of this is Apple submitted a patent for rounded corners. They said that they had invented rounded corners. Obviously, they know that one of the things they offer is innovative technology, and so they're using government regulation to try to keep out new competitors. Restrictive regulation can often serve incumbents. So we saw this in the taxi industry before Uber and Lyft, that there was just incredibly high regulation on taxi services, limo services. It was incredibly highly regulated. And the purpose of that was there were only a few taxis around, and the taxi companies wanted to be very powerful, wanted to lock down that industry, and wanted to prevent competition. And they were very, very effective at that. And that's one of the reasons that the service for taxis was so bad before Uber and Lyft, and then also why they were so expensive. Another threat to, or another entry barrier is access to distribution channels. Amazon is a really good example of this. If I want to sell basically any product, then I'm gonna have to sell it on Amazon, right? And Amazon has a lot of control over that distribution channel. And one thing they do is they pay attention to data on what are the most profitable products that they sell, and then they start making their own versions of them, and they start putting them at the very front of the page. So like, for example, when I search for an Oxford shirt, Amazon has their own brand of clothing lines called Good Threads. And when I search Oxford shirts, this is one of the first things that pops up. It's near the top of the page. It's pushing their own product. And so if I'm trying to sell Oxfords, I'm competing with Amazon, who is not only selling Oxfords, but they own the store that sells Oxfords too. And they're obviously going to be pushing their own products. Net neutrality concerns the rules of the biggest distribution channel, which is the internet. So if you're not familiar with net neutrality essentially says this, that say there's some like different websites you go to. Say you stream media at Netflix, on YouTube, and then also on Hulu. And currently right now, it doesn't matter which website I use, I'm paying the same rate, right? That if I stream a gig of data from Netflix, is going to cost me the same as if I stream a gig of information from Hulu. Now, let's just say hypothetically that my internet service provider, Comcast, has a relationship with one of these organizations. Say they own a stake in Hulu. What they can do is increase the price of data from Netflix and YouTube so that I actually have to pay more when I'm streaming from Netflix or YouTube than I do when I'm paying from Hulu. And by controlling that distribution channel, they can push customers away from competitors and to themselves. Regulatory capture can influence access to distribution channels. So regulatory capture is when the industry controls the government regulation of that industry. And I think the internet is a really good example of this. So this is Ajit Pai. He's the current head of the FCC. This is an actual picture of him. So if you don't hate him for the net neutrality thing, then you can at least hate him for this. He was former assistant general counsel for Verizon, one of the largest internet service providers, and he overturned net neutrality. He said that if organizations want, if companies want, they can have differential pricing for websites. So we see this influence where government regulation can actually be used as a tool to prevent entrepreneurship, to prevent innovation from coming in when it is captured by the existing competitors within that industry.